I'm David Spears. Welcome to Insiders. We're only 1 week into the new parliamentary year and already 2 departures have changed the game. Lydia Thorpe, at odds with her party over the voice to Parliament, quit the Greens to sit on the Senate crossbench. Alan Tudge, damaged by his relationship with a staffer and his handling of the Robodebt debacle, quit the Parliament altogether. His exit means a by-election is coming, a difficult test for Peter Dutton. The government, meanwhile, is facing growing challenges of its own. The cost of living crisis will be worse this year than previously forecast. The Reserve Bank is treading a precarious path, trying to tame inflation while avoiding a recession. The economic and political consequences of a misstep here are high. Labor MPs have begun taking potshots at the bank boss, Philip Lowe. His fate rests with the Treasurer, who joins us this morning. But first, here's the panel: Phil Curry, Catherine Murphy and Andrew Probyn. Let's start on this. Phil, the Reserve Bank lifted interest rates on Tuesday. Everyone expected that. What they didn't perhaps expect was the line from the Reserve Bank that there are more to come, could be several more to come. How did that go down in the government?
Look, I think the government anticipated that, but we're firmly into this period now where the politics of interest rates are sort of dominating. I mean, rates were pushed to record lows in the pandemic. There was a massive sort of response, and now it's a massive overcorrection to get them back. They should be going up, but it's just become politically difficult. And all the government wants to be able to say is that that's the end of it. And we saw Stephen Jones, the Assistant Treasurer, sort of hope wistfully after that last rate rise, maybe this will be the last one, even though the bank had said there'd be 2 more. So they've just got to manage it politically now and sort of explain to people why they're going up and sort of promise that there's light at the end of the tunnel. But
Stephen Jones, the Assistant Treasurer, wasn't alone. Quite a number of Labor MPs are speaking out now. They're publicly rebuking, challenging the Reserve Bank, saying, enough's enough, this should be it, we should pause for a while. The former leader, Bill Shorten, was amongst them.
I think inflation's coming down as it is. So the Reserve Bank, I hope, and some of the commentators who are urging them on to keep lifting the rates, they just need to take a deep breath. You don't want to cause bigger problems to Australians who are paying mortgages when the inflation problem is beginning to recede anyway.
A lot of those Labor MPs come from mortgage belt seats. Catherine, how coordinated or authorised do you think this is, or are they just simply reflecting what they're hearing?
Well, I think a bit of both, quite honestly. I think obviously it's sort of interesting because the new government came in, set up a review of the Reserve Bank, which they had telegraphed. There's also another kind of backing vocal to this whole situation, which is that the governor is due for reappointment later in the year, so whether Phil Lowe remains governor or not. So there's sort of, that's all in the background. Then there's obviously, government MPs understand that over the next few months, as people come off fixed mortgages, periods of fixed mortgages, that this is going to be really bad in terms of how it impacts their constituents. So there's a fair bit of public jawboning of the bank, obviously, and it's unusual. We don't see this a lot.
No, I think what we're seeing for the first time, or my time, is a real public loss of confidence in the bank, and that's because they got it so wrong. Their guidance was so poor when they said the cash rate would stay at 0.1 until 2024. Now, a lot of people probably made decisions based on that, thinking, we'll have the baby now and go back to one income, we'll do the reno now, whatever,
Or take a big mortgage and buy a new home.
Yeah, we've got a couple of years' grace until they go up again. So it's that sort of poor guidance, and I agree. I think the bank sort of had this sacred cow status for so long.
But it's poor guidance that's beyond the traditional buffer or the buffer that has been built when you're looking for that mortgage. To say, okay, we'll anticipate it's going to go up by 3 percentage points or whatever. That looked pretty reasonable. Now we're beyond that.
Yeah.
So I think it's about jawboning, but it's also about seeking insurance in the instance of those 800,000 coming back onto variable rates and being hit and whacked really, really mightily.
So, I mean, economists are divided on what the Reserve Bank should be doing. Should it keep going with rate rise until that inflation number really comes down, or should it pause now for a while? What about the government? Andrew, what can the government do now about this inflation problem?
Well, they can't do a great deal because the whole purpose of lifting interest rates is to hurt
Take money out
of the economy. So, people talk about wage rate spiral. where you sort of lift wages to keep up with the cost of servicing prices and whatever wage price index, I should say, spiral. You don't want to have a compensation price spiral, and that's what the government has to be conscious of. It can't fully compensate for what's being done by Philip Lowe. It can make things.
But they spent their entire time in opposition saying wages weren't keeping up with prices, that we got it, this was their priority.
And now higher wages are the enemy, that's the problem. Hang on, Phil Lowe's saying. I don't want it that high because that would cause problems. So you've got... now you've got the calisthenics of the economy, where you've got Jim Chalmers now saying, "Oh, you weren't going to be hit by a truck when it comes to electricity prices. You're only going to be hit by a minivan." Now that's basically the message in the newspapers today. It's still going to hurt you a lot.
Yeah.
But the whole purpose is it's meant to hurt you.
But just on what government can do about inflation, yes, wages is part of it. But in terms of government spending in the economy, Chris Richardson, the independent economist, was telling me during the week, the government would have to take about $6 billion out of the economy in an annual basis to avoid a 0.25% interest rate rise. That's the rough equation. Are they going to do that?
Well, look, the simple answer to the question, what can the government do? Well, two things. It can provide what it's going to provide for low and middle income earners in terms of electricity prices through rebates. That's one thing it can do. The other thing at the macro level is spend less. Take money out. Don't run an expansionary fiscal policy.
But everybody wants more spending on Medicare,
well, that's the problem.
All these people knocking on the Treasurer's door.
Yeah, that's
the
problem.
No.
Well, you have to say, I think you have to say no more than you would like, I suppose, because obviously there's a whole lot of, ministers running important social policy, Medicare. There's a huge amount of pent-up demand out there in the community to have these services strengthened, and that's core to a Labor government. But the economic circumstances sort of suggest caution.
Yeah. Well, the other compounding difficulty here, there'll be this big temporary windfall I mentioned because commodity prices have been so high. They get billions coming in the door.
Well, that puts pressure on, that puts demands on the Treasurer. Hey, you've got all this dough coming in.
Correct.
But Jim Chalmers has been saying all the right things for the last week. He's saying, look, we're going to bank that like we did in October. I think that, when they had a revenue surge, we're just going to shove it in the bank. We're not going to spend it. He sort of retrofitted this 3-point plan, spending restraint, cost of living relief where it can be given in the least inflationary way, like in the form of a power bill discount. But the other thing we haven't mentioned is also the sort of supply constraints which have driven up prices, getting those eased. So if you order a bicycle, you can get it next week and not in 6 months and pay a lot of money.
This is where some of these off-budget funds, the government would argue, will help. This is the $15 billion for various priority manufacturing areas. There are other off-budget funds to help rewire the nation and so on. The opposition's saying all this is going to be inflationary. The government seems to be saying, no, it's going to be the opposite.
Well, the IMF warned during the week that these are potentially inflationary if you don't phase them. I mean, if they've got $47 billion in off-budget spending, right? They've got 4 funds with 4. If they were to roll it all out next week, well, clearly...
But they're not. This is over a long period of time.
They're over 10, 15 years.
Yeah.
But to some extent, though, it does depend what those funds are directed towards. Obviously, sort of one of the major inflationary pressures in the economy at the moment is supply chain issues,
That's right.
which is sort of making goods more scarce. So it's sort of, I think it depends on how you target
how
them.
fast you roll it out, where you target it, this sort of thing. They are inflationary if you mismanage them, but I think the bigger problem that the Liberals have with those.
If you go sports rorts, sure,
well,
bit of a problem. But it depends how you target the saving. One thing also I think we did all forget too in terms of prices, or I did anyway. Obviously, some of these, like childcare relief, for example,
comes in from July.
Will take effect from July, and there's also been a reduction in the price of some prescription medicine.
These are all practical, aren't they?
But things like welfare increases and stuff like that, that's what the government's worried about, because that'll just shove money straight into the... I mean, Chalmers' mission is not to make the bank's job harder than it already is. He's got to keep monetary and fiscal policy aligned, and I'm sure he'll say it, but he's very mindful of that. And
so no more no more sort of cost of living relief, one-off payments on beyond the energy bill relief?
I wouldn't think so, even though, as you're saying, they're going to have lots of many billions sloshing around because of what's happening with iron ore and gas.
Shove it on the deficit, mate.
Yeah.
Pay off the debt.
And that serves a benefit in a financial sense, but there's going to be a whole lot of people probably on his own side saying, come on, give us a bit more.
Well, he's going to get this advice from the new committee they've set up on JobSeeker. Right, that's going to come before the budget.
Yeah, it's a couple of weeks before, isn't it? Or a week before?
2 weeks before they'll release a report.
And presumably that's going to say not
Raise the
whether
rate.
it needs to increase, but how
Raise
much
the
it needs
rate.
to increase by. So all of that, it's going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult. Time to talk to the Treasurer. Let's get to Jim Chalmers to take us there. He was the Shadow Treasurer, suggesting the government isn't focused enough on cost of living.
When the priority of the government is not the priority of Australians, you have a problem. And that is exactly the situation we have here. This is a scary time for Australians. I mean, if I'm an Australian family with $18,000 extra costs that weren't there just a few months ago, it is scary.
Jim Chalmers, welcome to the program.
Thanks very much, David.
So last year when you were Shadow Treasurer and inflation hit 5.1%, you called it a full-blown cost of living crisis. What would you call it now?
Well, David, I think that's an important reminder that the biggest quarterly contribution to this inflation we have in our economy right now was actually the March quarter before the election, and interest rates started rising before the election as well. We've been very upfront, I think, in saying that inflation is the biggest challenge in our economy, and that's why it's the major focus of the Albanese government and our economic plan.
Yeah, but it's gone up since then. It's now significantly higher than 5%. We've had 9 interest rate rises since then. If that was full-blown crisis, what is it now?
Well, it's a very difficult time for Australians dealing with these cost of living pressures which are coming at us from around the world but being felt around the kitchen tables of this country. And that's why the primary focus of our economic plan is a combination of 3 things. Cost of living relief, where it doesn't add to inflation, dealing with the issues in our supply chains, including our workforce issues that we inherited, and thirdly, showing some spending restraint in a responsible budget. So the 3 parts of our plan are the 3 Rs. Relief where we can, repair, and restraint. Those are the most important things that we can be doing right now, and that's why the ratings agencies and the international organisations have endorsed our plan.
Well, I want to get to some of those elements. Just on electricity prices, we were just talking about that. Can you just clear this up for us? Because we were told in October that electricity prices would go up some 56%. That was then revised down a little bit, revised up a little bit, in fact, in December. What's the situation now? How much will electricity prices rise?
Well, our energy plan is taking the pressure off inflation. You know, that was the key conclusion from the Reserve Bank's forecasts on Friday and the new numbers which are out today. Our plan is designed to take some of the edge off these energy price rises, and we're really encouraged to see that's the case. We're obviously not getting carried away. Obviously, some of the price rises from last year are still flowing through to bills, but it's a very encouraging outcome. In the budget for electricity, for example, the forecast was a 30% increase. That became 36%. Now we're expecting something closer to 23%. But those forecasts will be updated as well. But it's also an important reminder, and you played Angus Taylor a moment ago. When the opposition voted against our energy plan, they voted for even higher inflation. Our energy plan is taking some of the edge off this inflation in our economy, and that's a good thing.
So 23% electricity price rise this year. What about the following year? Because that was meant to be a further 20%, I think.
No, we're talking here about the second year of that forecast. The first number was the one that Angus Taylor hid from the Australian people during the election. We're dealing now with that, what was 30% at the budget, 36% in December, now looking more like 23%, but that will be updated in May. The most important thing to understand is that these new numbers out today, which are about the prices which are expected to flow in 2023 as a consequence of our plan, they are lower than they would otherwise be because of the steps that the Albanese government's taken.
What's the Treasury analysis on the gas price?
We'll update that in the May budget as well. I don't have that number for you today.
Why didn't they do gas as well as electricity for you today?
Well, the assumption at Christmas time was that a 20% increase would be more like single digits, more like somewhere closer to 5%, I think 4 or 6%. But we'll update that in the May budget.
When will power prices fall?
Well, it depends on the trajectory of the energy market from now. You know, we have numbers for the next year. We've seen some indications of that in the newspapers today, very encouraging indications that our energy plan will work through the course of 2023. But we'll update the figures, the forecast for electricity and for gas in the May budget.
Will they fall before the next election?
We'll update that in the May budget, David.
All right. The Reserve Bank is flagging more interest rate rises. Are you still confident we'll avoid a recession?
Well, that's our expectation based on the government's forecasts and the Reserve Bank's forecasts. Both of those institutions expect us to avoid that scenario. But clearly, we've got a combination of challenges in the economy right now, and we expect our economy to slow considerably this year. Both the Reserve Bank and the Treasury expect that to be the case because of that combination of consequences flowing through from higher interest rates and some tricky global conditions.
Your Labor colleagues are openly criticising the Reserve Bank Governor. We saw a bit of that just before. Some have said that he's using outdated data, ignoring the plight of mortgage holders and renters. Are they right?
I respect the independence of the Reserve Bank, David, and I think some of the points that people have been making through the course of the week, you know, about the lag impact of interest rate rises or the fact that the Reserve Bank expects inflation peaked at the end of last year, I don't think those points are especially controversial. And when it comes to the Governor more broadly, you know, we'll come to a view, as I've said a number of times, closer to the middle of the year after consultation with the Prime Minister and my Cabinet colleagues. About whether or not the Governor is reappointed.
But I'll come to that. But right now, is he doing his job properly?
Well, he's got a hard job to do. He's got to balance the getting on top of this inflation challenge without crunching the economy.
Is he doing it right?
Well, I'm not going to second guess the Reserve Bank Governor.
You could say he's doing his job properly.
Well, I genuinely respect his independence, as I've said probably hundreds of times in opposition and now in government. I think that's an important feature of the system. I'm not going to second guess the decisions. I've got my own job to do, that best combination of relief, repair and restraint, and that's what I'm focused on.
What do you think about the Financial Review reported yesterday that the Governor attended a private lunch with bank traders, commercial bank traders on Thursday, and during the lunch we saw some movement in bond prices. Are you concerned about that?
Oh, look, the Governor operates independently from the government. I don't clear his commitments that he makes in his diary. I suspect that governors before Governor Lowe have met with different players in the market. If people have got particular concerns, they've got an opportunity to raise them directly with Governor Lowe, and he can explain. He can explain.
You're not asking questions of the Reserve Bank about that one?
Well, I think Governor Lowe will be before two parliamentary committees through the course of the week. No doubt people will want to ask him about that and he can explain it. I think there's a broader issue here about how the bank communicates the context for its decisions. This is one of the things that I've been discussing with the RBA review panel. I actually discussed it with them on Friday in one of the regular meetings that I have with the review panel. How they communicate their decisions and the context behind their decisions is one of the key focuses of that review.
So how should they communicate decisions?
Well, I'll receive the recommendations of the review next month. I've asked for that report to be provided to me on the 31st of March, and I commit to responding and releasing between then and the budget. So it will be released. It will be provided to me on the 31st of March. Released between then and the budget, and I'll provide an initial response. And one of the things that they will grapple with is the best way for the bank to communicate its decisions and the context for them.
So that's interesting. You'll get this RBA review at the end of March. You will respond to it before the May budget, so we'll know by the budget whether you intend to reshape the board and whether you intend to stick with Philip Lowe, extend the term of Philip Lowe as Governor?
I'll provide an initial response to the RBA review. I've asked for it on the 31st of March. I will respond in some fashion between then and the budget. I don't know the magnitude of all the recommendations, but I'll provide a view on it and I'll release it before the budget. When it comes to Governor Lowe's appointment, we will consider that closer to the middle of the year, but obviously the recommendations of the review will be part of that. It's important to remember what the review is and what it isn't. It is an opportunity to think about the best structures and processes and objectives of the Reserve Bank going forward. It isn't about one person or about one decision or even one set of decisions. It's about how we take the bank forward into the future. The decision about the Reserve Bank Governor will be similar. and it will be taken closer to the middle of the year in consultation with the Prime Minister and our Cabinet colleagues.
Just while we're on big reviews, Treasurer, the Productivity Commission's due to hand you their big 5-yearly review of, well, presumably looking at what to do about lacklustre productivity in Australia lately. Have you got that review yet?
I received it in the course of last week, David, and I've started going through it. It's important to remember that this review that I've been provided by the Productivity Commission and these recommendations, it is almost 1,000 pages in length. It's 9 volumes. There are more than 70 recommendations which go right across governments. And so what I will do now is I will go through it, I'll consult my colleagues. What I intend to do is to release it in the course of March if I can. I'm not obligated to release it until the end of May under the legislation, but I'd like to do that sooner, ideally in May, so that we can have this national debate about our productivity performance and some of the recommendations in there. Now, inevitably, a government won't pick up and run with every single one of the recommendations from the Productivity Commission, but there may be some that we can run with. There will be some that align with the government's economic plan and our policy objectives. But at the very least, if it kickstarts a proper conversation about how we boost productivity by investing in our people and making it easier for people to adapt and adopt technology and an economy increasingly powered by cleaner and cheaper, more reliable energy, then that will be a good thing.
Well, we look forward to seeing some of those big ideas and what you're going to do with them. Let's turn to the budget in May. Soaring commodity prices are going to give you at least a temporary windfall. Is there any chance you'll actually post a surplus this year?
We're not expecting to, David. In fact, we're not expecting a surplus in any of the 4 forward years currently. We will get a short-term boost to revenue, but we don't currently expect it to be like the one that we got in October.
Right.
Obviously, commodity prices are helping. Wages growth is helping. Low unemployment is helping. But the dollar has appreciated as well, and that cuts across things too. So we're not currently expecting a surplus in any of the 4 forward years. We are expecting a near-term improvement, but some of the pressures on the budget in the later years of the forward estimates and into the medium term are actually intensifying rather than easing.
Well, I want to get to that. With this windfall, I assume you're going to bank that? You're going to ignore calls to spend any of it?
We'll bank most of it. We haven't decided yet on the. We haven't decided yet on every element of the budget, and so I'm not going to preempt that. Our predecessors spent most of it. We will save most of it. We actually saved 99% of it over 2 years in the October budget and 92% over the forward estimates. What we'll do this time, every budget is obviously a series of fine judgments and a series of balances we need to strike. We'll focus on that cost of living relief. We'll focus on growing the economy and fixing our supply chains, but we will put a premium on restraint. And we will try and bank most of the temporary revenue upgrade we get from higher commodity prices.
Your October budget did, however, have a net increase in spending. What about this May budget? Will we see a net increase or a net reduction in spending?
Well, we haven't finished the budget yet, David. As you'd expect, we're in the middle of February and the budget is in the second week of May. So there's a lot of work to be done to finalise the budget. The magnitude of the spending matters, obviously, but the timing of the spending and the nature of the spending matters too. And so you picked up the October budget. In October, we made a big investment in early childhood education, and that is a spend, but it will have a big economic dividend. It will make our workforce bigger, and it will provide cost of living relief without adding to inflation. And so the nature of the spending matters too.
A couple of other things. Let me ask you about the stage 3 tax cuts. They're due to kick in next year. Your last estimate was that these would cost $254 billion over 10 years. Will the price tag now be even higher?
I haven't got a new number for you on that, David. We expect the number to be bigger, obviously, because there's another year in the forward estimates and another year in the 10-year horizon. Wages have been a bit stronger and unemployment has been a bit lower, and all of these things will matter when we update the various parameters. But obviously, the number will be bigger than it was in October. The
Reserve Bank is saying inflation will still be higher than it needs to be through next year. It won't get back down to their 2 to 3% target zone until mid-2025. So when these stage 3 tax cuts come in next year, will they add to inflation?
Well, it remains to be seen what conditions we have there. Obviously, we've got those forecasts, but forecasts are notoriously difficult at the best of times, and these are unpredictable times. I think we need to recognise that. We're seeing the beginnings of wages growth. We're expecting inflation to moderate. How those two things play out over the course of the next couple of years remains to be seen.
Yeah, but the Reserve Bank reckons it'll still be above its target zone next year. Wouldn't it be better, wiser, to at least delay these big stage 3 tax cuts until inflation is under control? Otherwise, you're just going to hurt mortgage holders, aren't you?
Well, as you know, David, we haven't changed our position on those stage 3 tax cuts, and as you identify in your question, they don't come in for more than a year now. And so a decision on those tax cuts of either nature wouldn't actually impact on the inflation challenge that's in our economy right now, which is our major focus, and that's why we've got that 3-point plan when it comes to relief, repair and restraint
closer
in
to the
budget.
time, closer to July next year, you might have a look at the inflation figure and have another look at whether it's the best time to lob in those stage 3 tax cuts to the economy?
We haven't changed our position, David. Obviously, every budget, the task for every budget is to balance the government's priorities and the pressures in the economy. I think this budget is different to the October budget in the sense that we're on the other side, ideally, of the inflation peak. The economy is slowing because of higher rates and a global downturn, and so we balance all of that as well. But there will still be a premium on restraint, there'll still be a premium on cost of living relief, and on trying to deal with some of these issues in our supply chain, which have made us more vulnerable to these pressures coming at us from around the world.
Just a final one, Treasurer, on wages. You mentioned those a few times. The Reserve Bank is warning pretty clearly now that wage growth is picking up. It's paying close attention to this, it says. It even says it's important to avoid a price-wage spiral. Do you agree there's a risk of a price-wage spiral?
We don't have an inflation problem in this economy because wages are too high. Wages have been stagnant for the best part of a decade because of our predecessors' deliberate approach to the economy.
The Reserve Bank's worried about this.
Well, the Reserve Bank and the Treasury and others, all the credible economic commentators know that we've got inflation in our economy because of global conditions combined with weaknesses in our supply chains and weaknesses in our energy market. That's very clear. I think it's very, very important that we get wages growing strongly and sustainably in our economy. I'm really pleased that we've seen the beginnings of that already. That is not the reason why we have this inflation challenge.
So the Reserve Bank shouldn't be worried about a price-wage spiral?
Well, I'm not worried about it because I think it's an important thing that we need to do in our economy to get wages growing again in a strong and sustainable and responsible way. We deal with inflation by providing cost of living relief, dealing with the supply chain issues and showing restraint in the budget.
Treasurer Jim Chalmers, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, David.
Let's get back to our panel. We're joined once again by Phil Coorey, Catherine Murphy and Andrew Probyn. Bit to unpack in all of that.
3 R's.
Yeah. Let's just start on the final point there. There is a bit of a difference, right, between the Treasurer and the Reserve Bank on how worried we should be about wage growth. Phil?
Yeah, because wage growth was a signature promise that Labor took the election, so they don't want you to be worried about it, basically, and you won't get an argument from people who are going to benefit from one. So the other thing I found interesting too on the stage 3 tax cuts, if I could jump in, is do those inflation forecasts already take into account the stage 3 tax cuts? Because they've been legislated.
Yeah, presumably.
So the budget forecast take into account. So I assume, so will they make it worse, or will it just stay as forecast? If you I mean, it's just, I don't know, but I wonder if that's a... Yeah.
It's a good point, but they're not changing their position on stage 3.
Not yet.
Not this year.
not this year. OK, so we will get the Reserve Bank review that was commissioned last year by the Treasurer by the end of next month, and a response to it, importantly, Catherine, by budget, right? So they want to deal with this. The decision on Philip Lowe presumably comes, I think the Treasurer signalled a little later, around the middle of the year. But that's going to sharpen the focus on the Reserve Bank and how they communicate their decisions. Yeah,
well, look, there are other central banks in other countries have more regular press conferences, for example. They don't just sort of issue a statement, sort of like the Vatican,
Philip Lowe, in fairness, has, I think, been better than his predecessors.
No, absolutely.
Press club speeches.
Yeah. And we saw him quite a lot during the pandemic, which I think was reassuring for a lot of people because he has that lovely reassuring demeanour as well, particularly when we were sort of in free fall over those first 6 months. But no, I think there's a case to answer there about how transparent the bank is in the normal course of proceedings.
We should get a full-blown press conference every month.
Well,
Why not?
Like they're a really important institution in the country, and they exercise a lot of direct power over people's circumstances.
Was the Treasurer leaving the door open too, I think, to putting more people on the board? You know, there's been this call to have the ACTU on the board, and, you know, Fred the working class guy or something like that. I suspect.
Too many corporate chiefs.
A bit more representative of society on the board.
Yeah, and as for the budget, Andrew, no surplus.
No
leaving
surplus.
a bit of room there to spend some of the windfall.
It's going to be way, way healthier because, you know, the assumption was back in October that that prices of iron ore, coal, gas would all be returning to what they have been historically. And of course, they're still relatively high, well, quite high in some instances. So that's many, many billions that's been thrown at Jim Chalmers' way. But yeah, he's saying no surplus. But the 3 R's, you know, relief, repair, restraint. We're going to hear a lot more of that. But he did also say that they'd be saving most of it, as you picked up in your interview. So there's going to be some spending in some form. I would say it's in household relief to some degree.
Let's turn to what's happening in Parliament. It's been a pretty busy week. The opposition really continuing a hardline approach on a lot of the big legislation. They're going to vote no to the $15 billion National Reconstruction Fund for manufacturing that we talked about earlier. They're also going to vote no on the safeguards mechanism changes. Now, you know, for those who aren't following it closely, this is the government's pathway to get to its climate targets and eventually net zero emissions by 2050. You know, the biggest emitters have to bring their emissions down or buy offsets. Now, Peter Dutton is saying it amounts to a new tax.
It's inflationary. It's going to make it more difficult for families, not easier for families. I don't think we realise in Canberra at the moment how difficult it is for families in the suburbs. They are really struggling, and they don't need extra costs and extra budget items and additional expenditure imposed on them by the Labor Party and the Greens.
Catherine, is this a new tax, a new cost? Is it inflationary?
Well, firstly, I need to confirm Canberra, in fact, does have suburbs. Just saying.
It costs a lot to live there.
In terms of is the safeguard mechanism a tax, well, to quote the great Andrew Probyn, it's Greg Hunt's tax. If it is a tax, what I mean by that, if you don't speak safeguard, is that this is actually a coalition policy. It was introduced by Tony Abbott, and what the government proposes to do is basically make it work. So it's not a tax. That's a nonsense. I think also another thing we need to make clear, David, is that not everybody loves the great new tax strategy. There was a discussion in Shadow Cabinet about what to do about the safeguard mechanism over 2 weeks. Two very senior moderates, Paul Fletcher and Simon Birmingham, said, should we be doing this? Should we actually be rejecting a piece of legislation that makes it easier for business to comply with its requirements?
Well, also noting the fact that I think every business group, as well as a lot of climate groups, are behind this, and not to forget what happened in the election to the Liberals.
Yeah, well,
they lost
if anything, to get certainty in this area.
Certainty,
And look, the Labor thought they had struck on some strategic genius using Greg Hunt's mechanism in answer to the interjection that it was Greg Hunt's tax. Peter Dutton simply said, well, this is different because this is compulsory. Well, it's only because it's been enlivened.
No.
It was basically so high under the original threshold that everyone didn't have to duck.
No, you're right. Sorry, I shouldn't have cut you off. But the point of the point, this piece of legislation, this particular piece of legislation, is for the crediting mechanism. Now, basically why business supports it is that it assists them to meet their obligations.
Yeah.
So it's kind of extraordinary.
If you strip out the complexity of all of it, the climate wars are still on, right?
Yes.
The Liberals, despite losing 17 seats to Teals, and
this is the concern.
Banking on inflation and cost of living working in their favour, and this will be a winning.
Yeah, Peter Dutton's sort of steering it straight back to cost of living and going back in time on the old tax thing, but at some stage, I mean, the Liberals got a big wake up at the election on climate change. You know, those seats they lost, to the Teals and seats like Boothby in South Australia, and they've yet to make a concession to that that swing against them in a policy sense, you know, and you know, they voted against the 43%, and now they're going to try and, you know, vote against the safeguard mechanism, which is essential to both 43% and net zero by 2050. So you can sort of, it's one thing to sort of play hardball and we're going to make life hard for the government, but there's definitely gambling here by, you know, sort of opposing.
Absolutely. In the meantime,
what Phil's trying to say is that this is a disgrace. What they're doing.
I'm not sure he went that way.
It is. It's a disgrace.
But the other thing too, you know, they say the business groups are telling them one thing and saying another thing publicly.
Right.
But if that's the case, the worst thing you can do to the business groups is leave this thing at the mercy of the Greens. If the government's got to negotiate this through the Senate, and you've got to start making concessions to.
So now the government needs the Greens. +2, and we'll get to the new Senate lineup in a tick. But the Greens are saying this is not tough enough. They particularly want, on both this and the reconstruction fund for manufacturing, they want some guarantees around no new coal and gas. This is the mantra for the Greens really since the election. Andrew, will Labor have to? Is it a bit of a tricky one for
It's
Labor?
really tricky because, I mean, gas is going to be around for longer than coal. Coal's going to be around for quite some time yet. Gas might be one way, for example, to deliver hydrogen, which is the cleanest of all fuels. There's going to be a lot of argument here. It's an impossible one for the government to win because the Greens will push on the pure idealistic option, or they'll say it's an option, the idealistic future. You can't deal with them in that fashion. So they'll have to strike some agreement elsewhere, I would think, unless they do bend over and cripple their own legislation.
Or does that bring us back to where we were with the 43% target, where they just call the Greens bluff and say, you're going to stand in the way of this again? Because this is all part of the same policy, right? It's just this safeguard mechanism applies to 215 largest emitters, and it puts them on this trajectory to lower their emissions over time. And it's essential. It's all intertwined. Are the Greens going to actually put the perfect before the good again, and is the government going to have to sort of fall back on that?
Well, it becomes a steering competition again.
What would they do?
I don't know. They called their bluff last time on 43%, so maybe they'll do it again if the Libs are going to not play. Well,
look, I hope for the sake of the country and the sake of the emissions trajectory that this legislation passes the Parliament. It's very important that it does. In terms of, though, the whole issue with the Greens, now the rubber was always going to hit the road on no new oil, coal, gas, right? That was always going to happen. Obviously, Adam Bandt was pragmatic and constructive on the target. We were always going to meet a difficult sort of junction point here. So maybe it happens during the safeguard. The other thing that I have in the back of my mind is also the impact, and I know we'll get to this, David, but the departure of Lydia Thorpe.
Yeah.
Now, Lydia Thorpe is a formerly was a Victorian Greens senator. She's basically walked out on her own party and told their activist base, I'm going because they're not radical enough. Then Adam Bandt is walking into the safeguard debate. There will be pressure from his own base, basically, to hold the line on the principle.
Yeah, we'll come to Lydia Thorpe.
Didn't Senator Thorpe, she said she'd still vote with the
on climate issues.
Yes,
we'll come to Lydia Thorpe. I want to start, though, on the Aston by-election that's coming after Alan Tudge announced that he's leaving Parliament altogether. He, we know, never really recovered from the revelations around his affair with the former staffer Rochelle Miller, as well as his involvement as Human Services Minister in the whole robo-debt disaster. Here he was announcing he's quitting.
I certainly have not taken this decision lightly. My daughters, who are 18 and 16, know nothing other than their dad being away. They've had to put up with things that no teenager should have to, including death threats, the most recent of which was last week.
He held the seat of Aston in Melbourne at the election last year, but the Libs did take a big hit, Andrew, 10% margin down to 2.8%. What do you think? Can they hold on to it now?
Look, I mean, things have changed considerably insofar as Scott Morrison's no longer Liberal leader, so that changes atmospherics to some degree. But then Peter Dutton isn't very popular in Victoria.
And the Albanese government's more popular.
Yeah,
you
look at the primary vote for Labor since the election. It's I mean, polls are polls, but it has increased because there's a sort of realisation that,
it seemed to be doing a competent job.
Yeah, it seems to be doing a competent job. So there's a few things in the mix here. Anthony Green says it's a fairly conservative seat, so there might be a correction there. But there's no doubt the pressure's on Peter Dutton, but on things like his cost of living argument, on things like climate. But for the government and for the opposition, I should say the Liberal Party, it's how their various arguments on the voice goes. So there's a lot to be,
I think
in contest.
Yeah, cost of living, I think, will be the number one issue.
It's going to be fascinating.
Yeah,
it's a mortgage belt seat, and it's going to all these things we've been jabbering about for the last 40 minutes are all going to be tested, put to a real test in a bog standard suburban mortgage belt.
Could influence how things like the voice campaign goes and all of these things. History would suggest, Phil, oppositions don't lose by-elections. Hasn't happened for more than 100 years federally.
Yeah.
So,
well, we saw in July 2020, Labor held Eden Monero in a by-election.
Yeah.
And when Mike Kelly resigned to go get another job. And that was, Scott Morrison was quite popular then. Remember, the pandemic was just taking off and everyone was scared and the government was, support was surging behind the incumbent, and Albanese pulled off a by-election win there with a very good candidate. Dutton could well hold the seat.
He could.
And should hold the seat.
If he doesn't, what happens to Phil?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, it doesn't affect the numbers in the parliament, but I think up here for both sides, it won't be good for Peter Dutton if they lose it.
Yeah, I think the principal casualty, because obviously since the election, Peter Dutton is the leader of the Liberal Party because, the right faction has commanded the Liberal Party. The moderate wing was all but decimated. So I don't know that there's any particular threat on his leadership. But I think there is a referendum in Aston about the strategy of saying no to everything. There will, because obviously Peter Dutton will define the question in Aston as cost of living. What was the tagline in Parliament? Why does it cost more? Right. Labor will obviously have to answer those specific issues in terms of their own agenda and what they're doing. But what I would expect is that Anthony Albanese will implicitly ask the voters of Aston, are you comfortable with the alternate Prime Minister saying no to absolutely everything, including his own policy?
Conversely, if the Libs do well there, that might spook the government on how hard this cost of living issue is biting. Just a couple of process things here. Peter Dutton saying he wants a woman. Yep. It needs to be put to the branch or the division in Victoria. My understanding is they have the admin committee are a bit split on whether to go with a rank and file pre-selection or have what's called an admin selection where they handpick the candidate. Labor's national executive has not yet decided formally whether to run, but they will. And they might go again with Mary Doyle, who ran for Labor in the seat last time. So we'll see what happens there. Meanwhile, the week began, the first day of Parliament for the year began with Lydia Thorpe, as mentioned, quitting the Greens. I want to show you a bit of that where she announced why she was parting ways.
Now I will be able to speak freely on all issues from a sovereign perspective without being constrained by portfolios and agreed party positions. Greens MPs, members and supporters have told me they want to support the voice. This is at odds with the community of activists who are saying treaty before voice.
So, Catherine, the Greens now have one less. They've got 11 in the Senate, but they're more unified on the voice. So does this leave them in a weaker or a stronger position?
I think it's sort of tricky, really. I mean, obviously, this departure does help the Greens campaign with full voice.
They did it within, an hour or two?
Yeah. No. It helps. It does help their position in terms of the referendum campaign. In terms of the sort of after effects, though, look, it's hard to judge. Sitting here now, it's hard to judge. But the principal one I have in my mind is the sort of the split in the activist base. The sort of point I was trying to make earlier about what's the impact of Thorpe's departure. Like the dialogue that a Greens leader has with the base is, the sort of balance between achieving things, practical things, and the permanent campaign, right? Like that's a constant dialogue that the Greens leader has with the base. Now, I don't know, but I wonder whether a prominent person departing basically reflecting on her own party, saying you're not radical enough, I think that then makes the position for Adam Bandt trickier. For the government, Andrew, if the coalition's not with them, they now need the Greens plus 2, so not just the Greens plus David Pocock. Which instantly throws Jackie Lambie back into prominence because she can offer the 2 there and then. But it does get the prospect of there being tighter, more contentious legislation and contests, it gets a bit more awkward for the government. I think it's a bit of a suck and see, though, isn't it? I mean, well, let's see whether Lydia Thorpe turns up to votes, you know, or whether she just simply vacates the field on things that on other issues. Meanwhile, on The Voice, Phil, you broke the story this week of the pamphlet, which will now be sent out to all voters. What will that actually explain?
Well, if it's based on the one they sent out during the Republic referendum, it has a sort of picture of the ballot paper, how to vote yes, how to vote no. It tells you what a referendum is. A lot of people haven't voted in a referendum. It explains what a double majority is, you know, majority of the states, majority of the thing. And the one I found in my desk when I was cleaning up from 1999 had large tracts of the Constitution. So it had, this is how it reads now, this is how it would read under the change. And then it spells out the yes and no case. So the yes. And will this one have the yes and no case? Yes, and it should. I mean, you know, in a civil sort of manner. But the yes people say this is why you should have one, and the no people say this is why we're against. And it's just a very sort of neutral document. And was this a concession from the Prime Minister to the Libs? Yeah, it was. I mean, he just sort of told Don Farrell, who's the Special Minister of State, just get it done. I think if you thought about it for more than 5 seconds, it's a good idea. Like, it could actually help the yes case. And I mean, I sort of talk about people in my age group in our 50s, you know, fellows I play golf with, sort of saying, well, are they going to send us something on this? You know, you don't tell people to go Google it. If you want someone to do something, you know, facilitate it. Don't tell them to Google it, mate. And well, it's interesting, and it's a good way to spell out how sort of harmless this thing could be. Yeah, apparently it was a couple of Liberal moderates who came to the government and said this would help us. Yes. Now, I don't know if it's going to help. It's enough to help win over Peter Dutton. He's meeting again with the referendum working group Friday. Just quickly, Andrew, is that going to change much, do you think? Look, I mean, he'll get the opportunity to ask his 15 questions, and some of them have already been answered. You know, no veto power, no control over programs. But the government's tactics have been really interesting. They've been so cautious, they're timid. And, you know, questions like, you know, National Cabinet, you know, it was obvious, yes. They're not going to sit on that. They're not going to sit on it, but they would advise National Cabinet when it's a matter that affects them, but they don't have to take the advice. All right. Our panel, Phil Curry, Catherine Murphy and Andrew Probyn, will be back shortly with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with photographer for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age in the Canberra Parliamentary Press Gallery, the one and only Alex Ellinghausen, and a very warm welcome, mate.
Good morning, Mike. Thanks for having me.
First week back at Parliament, and are you match fit?
Oh, look, it's a bit of a shock to the system, isn't it, coming back after a bit of a break?
Alex, there were true believers and Broad's Church members at the traditional ecumenical service, which is the traditional way to start a parliamentary year. They share it around, don't they, between the different denominations. And for a brief moment there, the leader of the opposition, Anthony Albanese, they joined the choir boys.
Yeah, they met up with the choir after the service and posed for a few photos. Yep.
Well, being choir boys, I guess they both hope they're going to run to paradise, right? See what I did there? Why do we like this event photographically? What does it give us?
Oh, look, it's one of those events where you actually get the Prime Minister and the opposition leader in close proximity with each other. You know, you get the interactions between the both of them, the conversations between the both of them. And, you know, it's become a bit of a tradition every year on the first sitting day of Parliament, they do this.
Alex, it's time to get the party started, and they have their traditional fire-up events, which are the party meetings, which are very helpfully on at the same time.
Yeah, it's always a bit of a juggle, trying to get to both, isn't it?
So Anthony Albanese, he fired up the crew and he had his Indigenous caucus front and centre. Yep. And Peter Dutton fired up his crew. He had the former leader front and centre.
Yep, he's sitting right at the front.
Right at the front. What are you looking for picture-wise from the party room events? What are you trying to get?
Look, I think usually what the leaders do for these events is they try and set the agenda for what's going to be important for that week or even that year. You know, they're trying to do a bit of a scene setter, trying to fire up the troops.
We're wheeled in. The media's coming and then they're wheeled out again.
That's right.
So it's kind of theatre. Kermit the Frog said it's not easy being green, and Lydia Thorpe took it one step further and left the party altogether. She's quite a animated character to photograph, Lydia.
Yeah, but there's also detail involved in this as well. And I mean, look at the detail in the earrings. Sovereignty never ceded.
And so she's now joined the crossbench. So in the Senate, the crossbench is now swollen, and these are great pictures of David Pocock, I guess, welcoming her to the crossbench. I did love this Mark Knight cartoon. It's she's kicking the Bant sidecar to the side, get off, born to be mild.
He looks like he's about to be adopting the brace position very shortly, the decoupling of the sidecar.
We had a visitor who was told at one point he would never be able to set foot in Australia, Behrouz Boochani, who was a Kurdish Iranian journalist and human rights defender, writer, film producer, and he was invited into Parliament.
He's standing there in the main committee room, and for those not aware, for someone who is told that he would not ever set foot in Australia, to be here in the main committee room. This is where Prime Ministers do press conferences. This is where the Prime Minister and the Premiers hold their post-National Cabinet or COAG meeting press conferences. He's right there.
He's lovely to photograph. I find he's sort of got this almost 1,000-yard stare to his...
There's an intensity to his eyes.
There's intensity to it. We saw this week some amazing scenes in Parliament where they had to re-establish Nauru as a regional processing centre because the legislation had lapsed. Kathy Wilcox has a very poignant cartoon. If only there were more bipartisanship as Dutton resists the voice and then Labor keeps cruel Nauru policy then again. They came in for a fair bit of criticism for having to do this.
Yeah, and this cartoon really cuts through.
Yeah, it really does. Alex, it's been a very hectic week. Thanks for unpicking the many events that happened. I'll let you do the honours.
Thanks for having me, Mike, and back to you, David.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Mike. Let's get some final observations. Andrew, to you first.
Look, while we've been sitting here, reports have come through from North America that a third object has been shot down. Now, it's been the historical curio is that they're F-22s that have done it. That's the same plane that Australia did want to get at one point. We got the F-35s instead.
We weren't allowed, weren't we?
We weren't allowed. The Pentagon wouldn't allow it. So Americans will give us a nuclear-powered submarine, but not the F-22 that can knock out strange objects from the sky.
All right, Catherine.
This week, both Houses of Parliament debated a motion about parliamentary standards of behaviour codes that apply both to parliamentarians and staff. This is long overdue and important, but I want to say a couple of things about it. One, that they have not yet resolved or landed an enforcement mechanism for those codes. It's very important they do that and not drop the ball on it now that media attention has wandered off in other directions. And also, there are a number of parliamentary staff who had terrible experiences in the building one way or another, who will live with those experiences for a long time. So it's very important, I think, for those people to basically have, something to hang on to about a changing culture.
Yeah, Phil.
Really quick, Minerals Council of Australia ran ads very briefly about a week ago, just to warn the government away from touching the diesel fuel excise, which comes up every budget and never gets touched. But it was actually more a shot across the bow ahead of what's going to be a fairly big fight on industrial relations later this year when Tony Burke tries to remove labour hire provisions, and the miners and others are gearing up for a big fight on that. And that was a bit of a, we're prepared to throw some money at you this time, warning.
And a final cheerio.
And I'd just like to say good day to my mum.
Yeah, g'day to Phil's mum.
Yes, we all want to say hello.
Thank you all very much for joining us this morning. Now, finally, journos are often accused of being too combative in press conferences. This perhaps took things a little too far in the other direction, but hey, it was Volodymyr Zelensky. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
Next, can't call on BBC Ukraine.
Вітаю, пане президенте. Дякую за ваш приїзд. Я б вас хотіла обійняти і подякувати, але не можна.
Чому?
Але не застрелять.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.